Good evening. We're at the...
Perfect.
Great. So I was slightly worried there. I was thinking I would not. morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending wherever you are in the world. My name is Anthony Hobley. I'm the co-executive director of the Mission Possible Partnership and an executive fellow at the World Economic Forum. On behalf of both the World Economic Forum and the Mission Possible Partnership, I would like to welcome everyone to this virtual fireside chat with industry leaders on net zero steel. This net zero steel session is part of the climate breakthroughs, the road to COP26 and beyond, that the forum is proud to co-host with the COP26 high-level climate champions, the COP26 president, and our Mission Possible partners. The Race to the Zero Breakthroughs is a campaign launched at the Davos Agenda in 2021 in January. By the high-level champions for climate action, and it provides a comprehensive, detailed and actionable roadmap for achieving net zero through wholesale systems change, actually something Nigel Toppin and I discussed on video earlier this week. But across nearly 30 wholesale sectors of the global economy. Now, 6 months from COP26, this Climate Breakthroughs event is going to explore what true transformational change looks like. During this meeting, we will focus on steel, and I really do encourage you to join the sessions on hydrogen and shipping later, where we will look at this same issue from different perspectives. I'm pleased to introduce Nigel Toppin, a good friend and long-time companion on this journey, our high-level climate action champion for the COP26 negotiations, who I invite to share his opening remarks and kick off this meeting. Over to you, Nigel. Those fatal words that
Thank you, Anthony.
Generation, you're on mute.
Thank you, Anthony. It's delighted to be joining the session with you and the panelists. And I'm really looking forward to learning from the panelists, and in fact for this whole day being about how do we reach these race to zero breakthroughs. I think that you talked about being a fellow traveller or companion, and I think this is one of the exciting things here is that we're learning how to do industrial transformation with a combination of collaboration and competition. And so the whole idea of the Race to Zero is to bring together this growing ecosystem of the most important companies, cities, investors, banks, think tanks and civil society with this single unifying goal to implement the top level of ambition of the Paris Agreement, getting to zero in the 40s, but halving collectively by 2030 as the science demands. We seem to have really passed the tipping point in terms of agreement that we need scientifically rigorous net zero commitments, and I think the Mission Possible Partnership and the UN Climate Action Pathways together are really helping to translate those near-term actions into specific pathways, and that's I'm sure we're going to hear about that from the companies in the panel today. I think the thing that we're trying to do is, as you say, accelerate these tipping points. And so what we've tried to do is define these breakthroughs as, if you like, intermediate systemic goals, which I think serve three functions. They help magnify the impact of individual actions when individual actors can demonstrate that their individual pathway is aligned with those collective tipping points. I think they also help drive this radical collaboration that we've talked about so much. And I think that the Mission Possible platform, with all of the partners and all the different collaborations by sector and the hundreds of companies involved, really embodies. And then thirdly, they really allow us to focus on the near term. And when we all know that it's easy to say what 5 CEOs down the road are going to deliver in 2050, it's much harder and more meaningful and necessary to say, what are we going to do in the next 5 and 10 years? How are we allocating CapEx now? What are our innovation? What are we focusing on from an innovation point of view? So I'm also delighted that today we're updating the climate action pathways for industry, which have been collated by the UN Marrakesh Partnership, which includes all of these collaborations. So it's not original research; it's pulling together the best and really trying to converge. I think we're now able to increasingly show how actors from within and across systems can play their part in accelerating, particularly across these the heavy industry sectors that you're working on ever since the great first report that Faustine and team pulled together at the Energy Transitions Commission. I think the really exciting thing now is that we see momentum building. I talk all the time about exponential change, the nature of industrial transformations. We have over 71% of global economy covered by net zero commitments. And we're seeing, I think we can say we passed an inflection point there. For me, the interesting thing, of course, is that it's not just about the steel industry, but the steel industry plays this crucial role in the global economy. It's about the supply side, we see a lot of moves towards net zero in the built environment, which of course is I think it's the number one user of steel, and in the automotive sector. I remember, a few years ago working with Mercedes when they made their net zero 2039 commitment, and one of the conversations in the company immediately was, so that means we're going to have to buy net zero steel by 2039. So it'd be interesting to hear from the panel about how that combination of policy, supply side innovation, demand side pull, and finance all interconnect. And of course, just a few weeks ago with Mark Carney, we launched this massive coalition on finance, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. That's the Race to Zero club for finance, 160 firms so far with $70 trillion of assets. So really keen to see how these all play out with this crucial industry that's the heart of the world economy. I know it's the most widely used material. I bought quite a lot of steel when I was working in the automotive industry, making brake pads. 40% of the components were steel based. But of course, we know this is a huge challenge because at the moment, steel making is one of the biggest emitters of CO2. So we can say that's really hard, or we can say this is exciting because it's a challenge that requires reimagining the science of steel making. And I know that's what you're all doing. So we're going to need to rely on some really interesting breakthroughs in things like renewable hydrogen. And I know that we have a panel later today about hydrogen. We're also going to need more collaboration across value chains and across industry. We really thrilled to see that already there's more than 15 low carbon steel projects planned by 2030. And the breakthrough that we set was to see at least 20 commercial scale facilities up and running by 2030. So it'd be great to hear more about that. We, of course, need to be able to get to Glasgow and tell the story to the world, not just that we've agreed on the pathway, but that action is in place, capital is flowing. And we need to hear what more do other members of that system, what the policymakers need to do to provide the supportive frameworks. What do suppliers need to do to retool their factories, and what can buyers do to help on the demand side? So I'm really delighted that we're going to be hearing from Aditya Mittal from ArcelorMittal on the role of producers, and from Elizabeth Brinton from Shell on the importance of cross-sectoral collaboration. I know Shell will be putting a lot of focus on that. How do you collaborate on the demand side? So Anthony, thank you so much for inviting me. Really keen to see what we can unlock in this conversation. And let me hand back to you to run the panel. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nigel. And if you want to know more about Nigel and my thoughts and our discussion on systems change, check out the video we did together and the blog, which is on the forum website, and the Mission Possible Partnership website. Now I'm absolutely delighted to introduce the moderator of today's meeting, Faustine de la Salle, the director at the Energy Transitions Commission, and I'm delighted, even more delighted to say, my co-executive director of the Mission Possible Partnership. I think we like to think of ourselves as the dream team. Faustine is also leading the Mission Possible Partnership's Net Zero Steel initiative, and is therefore the ideal person to guide the following conversation. Faustine, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Anthony. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and it's a pleasure to welcome to this fireside chat Aditya Mittal, the Chief Executive Officer of ArcelorMittal, and Elizabeth Brinton, who's the Executive Vice President for Renewables and Energy Solutions at Shell. So I'm really looking forward to the next half an hour or so. As you probably know, if you've followed past sessions, there is a Slido in place for you to ask questions as we go through the discussion today. We might not get to all questions that you asked through Slido, but we'll do our best to pick up on some key themes. And your questions also feed into the work that we're doing with the Mission Possible Partnership ahead of COP26. Nigel has already introduced the topic today very well, so I'll be very brief. As we all know, steel represents 7 to 8% of global emissions from the energy system today, and we need to bring that to net zero by mid-century to be in line with an IPCC 1.5 scenario. The technologies to do that are on the horizon, both in terms of increasing the use of scrap through recycling steel, but also through the deployment of new zero carbon production technologies for all base primary steel production. But we have a challenge of pace. If those technologies are going to be deployed at scale, given the lifetime of steel assets, we need those technologies to be brought to market and to be as cheap as possible before 2030. So the next decade is absolutely crucial if we want to unlock change in the steel sector. And that's why we've set up the Net Zero Steel Initiative to really try unlock value chain collaboration to make it happen. Because as Nigel was saying earlier, our strong belief is that it takes a full value chain to decarbonize the hard-to-abate sector. It takes collaboration between the steel manufacturers and their environments, their energy providers, their buyers, their finance players, but also governments to really create a favorable environment for investment. And that's the discussion that I want to have today with Aditya and Elizabeth, is to better understand how do we make that magic happen over the next few years. So I'll turn to you first, Aditya. Thanks again for being with us today. You lead one of the biggest steel producers worldwide. ArcelorMittal has made very ambitious commitments for 2050, but also for 2030. My initial question to you is, how are you going to achieve those goals that you've set out for your company? What's your role in that transition, and what help do you expect from players around you in your value chain?
Fantastic. So good morning, everyone who's joining us, and thank you, Faustine. Thank you, Nigel, for your opening remarks. Thank you to the WEF for organizing this. I'm actually very thrilled to be part of this panel because I'm very excited about the prospects of net zero steel. I think Faustine talked about it, Nigel alluded to. The bad news is that steel is responsible for 7 to 8% of global emissions. So it's a huge issue when you look at the whole climate change discussion. I think the good news, maybe the okay news, is that even in spite of being responsible for 7 to 8% of global emissions, it is a material of choice because it has the lowest carbon footprint of any other material today. So we're starting with relatively low carbon footprint, multiple times lower than aluminium or other carbon-based materials. It's infinitely recyclable. So when you look at plastics, what plastics want to do in 20 years, steel can do today. So you're starting with a good base. And I think the really good news, and I think that's why we're having this panel, is that we have the pathway to net zero steel, right? And I think Faustine mentioned that there are technology solutions. I think fundamentally there are 3 pathways. The first is a direct reduced iron, which is natural gas based today. So instead of using coal, you use natural gas. You can now substitute that with hydrogen. We have a pilot facility in Hamburg, actually, where we're experimenting with hydrogen and DRI. And obviously that dramatically reduces the carbon footprint. We can also deploy CCU technologies where we can capture the carbon, convert it into advanced biofuels. We have a project in Belgium where we're doing that, and we can produce advanced biofuels. And then obviously the R&D project, and not for this decade, is direct electrolysis. So I'll keep direct electrolysis discussion to the side because I think just with DRI, natural gas or DRI hydrogen, and with CCU, we can achieve net zero steel. The other positive is the market. So I know Nigel talked about Daimler and when he worked with brake pad manufacturers. If he was there at those companies today, they would tell them that ArcelorMittal actually can supply them certified green steel, which has a carbon footprint of 0. So scope 3 emissions of 0. We're the first steel company to do that. And we launched it. We thought we'd ask the market and see what the response is. And the response has been tremendous. So every customer wants some of it. We're sold out, which is great. We have more product coming in next year. But what is interesting is when we Germany market is they're talking to their own customers and trying to get a sense, because we're a little bit of our customers are intermediates, right? So the warehouse manufacturer wants to go to the e-tailers and understand, do we want now green warehouses? If we sell it to an automotive, how much will a customer pay for a green car? So that's also very positive. I think in terms of ecosystem, we have Shell on the panel. They are a market leader, and we have good collaboration on how we can use hydrogen or other or electricity to continue to decarbonize. The area which is lacking is the level playing field or the regulatory environment. So we have the technology capability, very excited by the market prospects. I think there's a good ecosystem of industry and other participants coming together to find a holistic solution. But our concern is that if there's no level playing field, what do we do with all of these ideas and technology solutions? Because if we implement it, increase our capex cost and opex cost, and then we get undercut by other producers where there's no cost of CO2 and their emissions are actually higher than ours today, then we're just hollowing out the European steel industry or the developed world steel industry. So for us, we can accelerate, we can go very fast. We actually have lots of plans, not only in Europe, but also in North America to decarbonize our process at remarkable speed, germinated the market. But what we need is regulatory support to make us fund that transition in an economic basis. So I think we will get there based on the discussions we're having with various governments. I see a lot of appetite. The other small thing I will put in this, and maybe it's a lot of information, but I think worth putting out there, is that the cost to decarbonize steel is much cheaper than the cost to decarbonize any other sector, or at least we looked at a few sectors, so transportation, chemicals, plastics. Because for 150 million or 300 million, depending on which geography it is, you can permanently reduce 1 million ton of CO2 emissions. And so when we talk to government, they get very excited by that because the amount of capital that's going into transportation is a multiple of that. The renewable sector is still a multiple of that. So there's an appetite to achieve this at not crazy cost levels, at reasonable cost levels. And so I do think that eventually we will make the regulatory balance or achieve the regulatory balance which will allow us to decarbonize. So very excited. I think we're on the right path, but clearly to accelerate, we need more support.
Thanks a lot, Aditya. And there's a lot to unpack in what you've just said. We'll come back to it in a moment. I first want to welcome Elizabeth to our discussion as well. Elizabeth, you represent Shell on this panel. Shell has put out a net zero target by 2050. You've also very recently been addressed by a Dutch court suggesting that maybe you weren't going fast enough in your decarbonization pathway. I'd love to hear from you. What are the steps that you're taking to reach your target of net zero emissions by 2050? How fast do you think you can go in the 2020s? And what's the role of your collaboration with your clients, the likes of ArcelorMittal, on that journey?
Thank you, Faustine, and again, and Anthony and Nigel and Adit. It's just a pleasure to be part of this panel today. I'm going to start with the last part of your question, which is about collaboration. It is exactly being able to partner with global leading companies such as ArcelorMittal and actually deliver, because you can't, as an energy company, you can't accelerate without somewhere to sell your green solutions. And so it's this meeting together between supply and demand balance that helps us really accelerate. So on the renewable side, many global big brands that you recognize, whether it's Microsoft or Amazon on the big superscalar cloud companies, all the way through other industrial companies who've signed up for the RE100, those commitments to go to 100% renewables then open the door for big renewables at scale. Because solar has been happening for a long time, but it was really a big company, a big industrial company like Shell has a specialization in scale. And so it's precisely this alignment where you see policy. So for example, building on what Adit said, it's essential that we have carbon pricing so you can have differentiation and that you can also have a level playing field and also allow innovation through technology neutrality. I'm from California, so I will use California as an example, is that we actually led the world, and I had the privilege of being part of that, of establishing the world's first carbon market when we passed the landmark legislation of AB 32 back in the early 2000s. Now, everybody said, oh, no, that was going to potentially kill the economy and drive out industry from California. Well, at that time, California was the 8th largest economy in the world after we led with AB 32, the Renewable Portfolio Standard, and landmark climate legislation. Lo and behold, California passed the UK and became the 5th largest GDP in the world, proving as a fact that you can actually set very aggressive carbon goals and environmental and renewable targets, et cetera, and actually create huge uplift for your economy if you align the right balance. And so it's all about that supply-demand balance. So for example, we have a partnership with Toyota, with Shell in California, and we just set the world's record for the amount of hydrogen provided to transportation vehicles across light duty and trucks in the world. So that acceleration is possible when you create an ecosystem that aligns because we're listed companies, we're commercial entities, and so we have to be able, you can produce green products. If you have nowhere to go, you can't do it. And that is the story of hydrogen, for example. In my previous company back in the day, in that early 2000s, I actually installed the world's first hydrogen fueling station on the planet, but there were no vehicles to take the hydrogen. So that's a great story because there was policy incentive. We as an energy company could provide the supply and produce it, but there were no vehicles to buy it. And so then when we learned that lesson and we went into partnership with Toyota, we aligned the supply and demand so that as they brought the Mirai vehicles into the market, we were producing more. And then you have economic transformation. So it goes back to something that Nigel said that's so important. For systems change, you need the government support to create an ecosystem that enables all the actors to align and do the right thing commercially, create that pull through. And you also need to make sure that you have that timing so that you can actually begin to build and transform your economy. And California is an example of how you can do that with great GDP results.
Thanks a lot, Elizabeth. And that connects very well with what Aditya was saying around really mobilizing customers to get interested and buy that green steel, zero carbon steel that you were talking about, Aditya. I want to turn back to you. We really see that there is a full chain of offtake agreements, basically, that is required all the way from the end consumer to your automotive manufacturer, for instance, who would have to commit and buy new forms of steel from an ArcelorMittal, and then an ArcelorMittal would have a demand for new forms of energy from a Shell. This whole chain that we've described in several reports, including one launched today, is difficult to put in place, and some of that can be done on a voluntary basis. What you were saying earlier, those companies that currently buy zero carbon steel, I suppose are doing it on a voluntary basis, but at some point you need to shift to regulatory levers. So how do you see that balance? How far can we go with those voluntary agreements? And when do you need policy making to actually kick off to create that bigger market at a bigger scale?
Sure. Thank you, Faustine, and thank you, Elizabeth, for all your remarks. You're absolutely right. Today, it's on a voluntary basis. I think it's experimental. We have very limited quantities. It's certified as being net zero. And clearly, our customers are trying to understand what is their customers' interest and offtake. So you're absolutely right. In terms of my thought process or how we see it developing, I think the first news is that we have been actually surprised by the level of interest. So we did not think this early on when, as you mentioned, there is no regulatory support or policy support on green steel. There is no car marketing which has saying that this is green steel, yet the customers are already experimenting. And this goes back to Nigel's point, I think, that we're reaching a tipping point and there is a movement to accelerate. So I think it's all positive. Based on the conversations we are having, we can see that there will be policy support, especially for infrastructure projects which are government funded or government support, that they would be requiring some sort of low carbon steel or certified green steel or recycled renewable steel and all of those products. I think eventually I look at this as if you're talking about cars, in the olden days when you bought a car, the aircon was an option. Right. So at some point in time, a more sustainable car will be like an option and some people will pay an extra for it. But in due course, that will become standardized. Right. So I'm not going to sit here and predict when that would be, but I think that will become standardized. And I think the policy support would accelerate standardization. So I think the free market is working. Clearly, it will only last with some measure of policy support and obviously with the final consumer demand.
One of the measures that is being discussed currently in Europe and in other regions to establish that level playing field is a carbon border adjustment. I'd be keen to hear, Aditya, what you think about it, and then Elizabeth, whether you think that this type of tool would also help a company like Shell in that transition. Aditya, maybe first?
Okay, sure. So yeah, absolutely. I think the key message is level playing field. Whether that's a carbon border adjustment or funding support in the European level as we transition to a uniform ETS system globally, that's all up for discussion. Right? Today, there's a carbon price, i.e. a carbon cost to producing steel in Europe. That needs to be rectified. And maybe the solution is that others have a similar ETS system. That's absolutely fine. Then you don't need a border adjustment. But till we arrive at that point, either our carbon costs are reinvested in our decarbonization initiatives. So at least then we feel economically we are whole. And if that's not happening, then clearly you need some sort of border support. Because I think we all know what happens if there is no level playing field, right? Our costs are higher, we have the technology solution, but then the steel will be produced in a country which has a worse carbon footprint, exported to Europe, again, more emissions. So at the end of the day, less steel in Europe and actually more global emissions. So no one wins in such a scenario. So creating the level playing field will be critical. It will allow us to continue to innovate because we have tremendous R&D capability. You would think the steel industry doesn't have R&D, but we have a lot of R&D. We actually spend $300 million a year on research and development. So there's a lot of technology solutions and product solutions that we can provide the market. But for that, there has to be a level playing field.
Elizabeth, same question to you. How does a border carbon adjustment fit into the broader policy framework that you would need to progress? And if I can squeeze a second question after that, one of the key drivers to reduce the cost also for ArcelorMittal and others is to reduce the cost of the energy input, the renewable energy, renewable power, renewable hydrogen, etc. So how can you as an energy producer also help those energy intensive industries access lower cost renewable energy to produce green products at a lower cost as well?
Thank you, Faustine. Just so you know, for the technical folks at the World Economic Forum, it's very difficult to hear you. So I'm leaning in, trying to capture what you said, but it's I don't know if it's on my computer end or on your end, but very, very difficult to hear and kind of coming in and out. So just maybe the folks in the background can do a sound check. So I think I'm going to start with the question on carbon. One of the things that Shell has been discussing for quite a while in our policy framework is important for carbon pricing, and that builds into what Adit said so eloquently about a level playing field. Because we need to make sure, if you think about Europe and the context of regional economies, you need to create virtuous systems that enable the decarbonization at pace and acceleration, and really believe that the positive incentives are what's going to drive the pull through, both from the demand and the supply side. It's very, very important. And that goes back to why I use the California example as well, because it created that positive ecosystem that then drives the change by having economic levers that actually are incentives of the right behavior in the right direction, so that companies can actually make an economic, and then the economics begin to work. And so then you see, for example, coal is a great example, is that coal has left the power system because of economics. And so it is, renewables actually are driving the spark spread. They're market pricing in many, many different markets now, which is a great thing. And so that's how it shows you, when you have that alignment, actually, the free market works in the right direction, which is quite exciting, which goes to your question about lower price of energy. So one of the things that's really important is actually creating a certainty of an investment path, because when you think about large assets at scale, apologies, that's at my end. My neighbor has started construction. Welcome to working from home in COVID, so apologies to everyone. I hope you can still hear me. In any case, what's really important is actually that alignment of investment certainty, because at scale projects, whether it's a big offshore wind farm or a green hydrogen electrolyzer at scale, like Shell has invested with our HKN wind farm here in the Netherlands, and then what we're doing with the Port of Rotterdam, that's a very, very large system. Those are like, that collectively will be an over $5 billion plus investment in capital by Shell in that single project. And so these are magnitudes of millions of dollars, billions of dollars rather, which is where a big balance sheet company like Shell comes in, because we have to move on scale. And that's where investment certainty and vehicles from the government policy come into effect, because you build a huge wind farm, 700, 800 megawatts or larger, big electrolyzers, 200 megawatts or larger. These are big industrial projects that have lifetime of 20 plus, 30, 40 years of useful life. And therefore you need that investment certainty of that path. And then that, in other words, then begins to create the price efficiency as those projects come in line. And it goes back to also that, again, that systems effect. In order to do that, we also have to make sure that you have a transmission network in Europe that can take on more electrons into the grid. We need to make sure that we're also creating policy, and this is something great that the Netherlands and Germany has done collectively, is saying, yeah, we can reutilize gas infrastructure for hydrogen injection. That also then begins to lower the cost, so that we're taking the assets that we have and transforming them in a positive manner for systems effect. And so these are the things that come together that begin to lower the cost, so that when Adit and I talk about working together, we can say, yeah, we can actually invest together, we can lower the cost and provide that mutual certainty on that pathway to green hydrogen, in this case, green steel.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I'm sorry I have apparently lost visual, but hopefully you can still hear me, or even hear me better than before. I'd love to turn back to Aditya to better understand how those collaborations can be put in place with your energy providers to really help with innovation. We know that there's a number of new technologies that need to be developed, hydrogen-based, carbon capture-based, you mentioned earlier, to bring primary steel technologies to market. How are you accelerating that innovation process as a steel manufacturer?
Yeah, thank you, Faustine. I think by talking to people like Elizabeth, we are accelerating our process, because we're actually figuring out how can we use hydrogen in our existing processes. So we have a pilot in Germany, in Hamburg, where we are using hydrogen today and understand what it does to the properties of steel. But just coming back to the broader point on energy, hydrogen, and CCS, I think when we look at the energy space today, renewable price is attractive, so it's not unattractive, right? Because we get it at the same price as other forms of electricity. The whole drive to bring down renewable cost is really to make hydrogen much more competitive. because at today's cost of power, hydrogen is very expensive, at least for our business. And so that's why this whole discussion, can we bring hydrogen down to €1.5 per kilo relative to maybe 3 to 4 euros where it's sitting today based on the energy cost. And that would basically mean energy costs have to reduce by 70% or something like that. So that is clearly a path that we're moving forward, and that's why all of Elizabeth's points were excellent. How can we use existing infrastructure? How can we provide policy certainty to make that happen? And we've seen in the past that as you invest, you learn, you develop IP, you develop capability, and costs come down. Nevertheless, I think we should not ignore the fact that in case costs remain elevated for a period of time, that there is a very strong role of CCU and CCS. And Elizabeth talked about this as well. And we see it in our business where we can use natural gas, existing renewable power, but with CCU, CCS, we can achieve the same net zero outcome without necessarily relying on hydrogen. So if hydrogen prices come down, fantastic. That's a solution that we have. But in case it takes longer, there should also be policy support, technology support, R&D attention to different CCU and CCS projects. So we're doing both. As I mentioned, we're using hydrogen, but as I mentioned earlier in my opening remarks, we also have a very interesting CCU project in Belgium, where we take the off gases and we actually have bacteria, microbes, which eat the off gases and convert it into advanced biofuels.
Thanks a lot, Aditya. We are slowly but surely heading towards the end of this session. Elizabeth, before we do a closing round, I want to ask you, what do you expect can be done by governments to also help you through that transition? And how do you also expect the finance players to play into that steel decarbonization story and more broadly the decarbonization of heavy industry?
Thank you, Faustine. It's good to hear you and see you back. Yes, so the role of finance is absolutely essential because it's not just about capital. Actually, there's plenty of capital that is hungry to move into the net zero space, which is fantastic. So that's another portion of collaboration is how do we have partners with banks, other infra funds and so forth who are interested in infrastructure and these green and net zero projects. So that's very, very exciting. But I think the really, really important and tough aspect of finance that is really needed is this area of sustainability finance that looks at risk. Because ultimately, from a commercial perspective, if I have to run to my RDS board and get approval for a project, I've got to answer to a commercial IRR return. And part of how you factor in your IRR return is you have to manage risk, and you want your risk and return aligned. And so it's the fundamentals of finance that then now, as we think about the energy transition and acceleration, how do we actually look at risk differently, and therefore to give the confidence to actually drive higher returns in areas such as renewables that currently have lower return because they're viewed as low risk. And so we have to, again, look for the levers that we can create virtuous pathways for acceleration. And that role of sustainable finance is absolutely essential. Bloomberg New Energy Finance talks about the missing money problem around renewables and everything to do with green hydrogen, et cetera. And that is also the case if you get into aviation fuel, sustainable aviation fuel, biofuels, et cetera. And so this is where policy and finance need to come together. And so, Nigel, it was wonderful to hear about your work on that as well, with the Mission Possible, because it's essential to really drive all of those factors coming together so that you can make investment decisions that are going to deliver commercial returns. Because again, to make the moves that we need to do in the next decade that are really going to have that impact and materiality for society, we need to do big scale. So it's right now, the exciting thing, technology is proven at the smaller scale, but to make the big scale leaps that we need, we need to have that financial lever lining up so that these projects really deliver commercial returns and in turn shareholder value, which then creates the virtuous circle for societal benefit.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I'm going to ask both of you the same last question to close this discussion. COP26 is on the horizon in less than 6 months' time. We are collectively through the Net Zero Steel Initiative and with our colleagues from the COP26 presidency and the Race to Zero high-level champions, working to unlock that scale, as you just described, Elizabeth, by COP. So I'd love to hear from you in a couple of sentences to close this discussion. How do you think we can really unlock that change by COP? What needs to happen for the steel sector decarbonization to be accelerated before the end of the year, or at least for the ingredients to be in place for an acceleration in the following months? We'll start with you, Elizabeth, and we'll close with Aditya.
Thank you so much, Faustine. The key is breaking across silos. So while it's very, very important for financial institutions and banks to collaborate together, and while it's very important to have different sectors collaborate together, part of what is so exciting about today's conversation and where solution and innovation will happen is bringing commercial leaders such as ourselves together with the financial leaders, together with policymakers. We have to break down the previous silos, because if you look at how policy and regulation is made, whether it's in the financial sector or the energy sector or steel, et cetera, it's all done in these narrow silos. And one of the best learnings from innovation out of Silicon Valley is that it's at the edge. Where things converge is where the magic happens. So my recommendation before COP is bring us together. Let's break down the silos, because that way someone like myself who's highly commercial, I can be with the right financial people, with audit, with our customers. We're pulling it because it is exactly systems, supply chain, and breaking down those silos for real collaboration. That's going to move the needle, and the policymakers have to get out of their silos as well, and that's how we can help. Be very practical.
Thank you. Aditya, same question to you.
Thank you, Faustine. I think Elizabeth captured a lot of the spirit. I guess my two comments. First of all, I appreciate Nigel has participated in the panel. So I hope you learned something about the steel business and the steel industry. And hopefully that helps our industry as we decarbonize through COP26. So I really thank him for his time and his participation. And I think we talked about this earlier in the panel. For the steel industry, we have the technology solutions. We think we will have a ready-made market. Our customers are very excited about the prospects. What we really need is policy support. So we need a level playing field. What form that comes, I mean, I leave to Nigel and the rest of the teams, but maybe it's a carbon border adjustment, maybe it's funding the transition, or maybe it's some sort of ETS system on a global basis. But as soon as that is in place, then innovation will kick in. People are energized already, but they'll be even more energized to find the solutions. And I think we have the full acceleration of the decarbonization of the steel sector. So anyway, I know he probably has a lot of stuff on his plate already, so we're just adding to it, but I appreciate his support and his participation.
Thank you very much to both. We are going to close this discussion here. There will be much more to be said, but I think the directions you've laid out are well noted both by Nigel, who I see nodding on my screen, as well as ourselves as the Mission Possible Partnership, to inform the work that we will be doing with you and with a lot of other players in the steel value chain over the coming months. So thanks again for joining us today, and apologies to the audience for the technical glitches we had today. It's all part of working from home from different locations in the world. So hopefully you'll still have had an opportunity to follow this very good discussion. Looking forward to the other panels this afternoon, and looking forward to speaking to all of you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.